Stranger, how you doing, Russell? Good to see you. It's been a while. Writing something. Let's get started. Me too. Thank you for yours. No.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are we ready to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So I'd like to welcome all of you joining us in person at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and to all of you joining us online for today's installment of the East-West Center Research Speaker Series. My name is Jean Lee. I'm the presidential chair here at the East-West Center, and I'm zooming in today from steamy South Korea. I wish I were there with you in person because it is hot and humid here. I am so grateful to my wonderful, hardworking colleagues here at the East-West Center for organizing these speaker talks. They feature scholars who are doing original and really innovative research and analysis on trends across Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And I'd also like to welcome our student volunteer, Hudson. Some of you may have seen him earlier, who is helping us with today's event. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Victor Cha back to the East-West Center. Dr. Cha is a familiar face here in Honolulu and in Seoul and in Washington, D.C., where he serves as the president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and as the Korea chair at CSIS, that's the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a distinguished professor at Georgetown University, and we're lucky to have him as an Adjunct Senior Fellow here at the East-West Center. Victor is also the author of 8 books, including Korea, A New History of South and North, which I have on my bookshelf at the East-West Center a couple floors below you. And most recently, The Black Box, Demystifying the Study of Korean Unification and North Korea. He's also served in the US government, not only on the National Security Council, but also more recently on the Defense Policy Board in an advisory role. So really the trifecta of working at a university, a think tank, and for the government. And so all of that certainly makes him a trusted and respected voice on foreign affairs, particularly on issues related to the Korean Peninsula. But today we've asked him to broaden his perspective just a little bit to include Iran for a talk on the implications of Iran strikes for US-DPRK diplomacy. And Victor, you and I have spoken on so many different aspects of issues related to Northeast Asia, but I don't think we've ever covered this topic. So I'm really looking forward to see what you have in store for us today. And we should have plenty of time for questions, so do queue them up, whether you're in person and online. I'm expecting, I heard somebody earlier say they were a junkie. I don't know who that was, but I'm happy that we've got a foreign policy junkie in the room, and I encourage you to ask a question later. So Victor, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me, Jean?
Yes.
Thank you, Jean, for that kind introduction. Thank you for getting up so early in Seoul to join us today. I'm sorry that we can't see each other in person, but as you mentioned, I come back to Hawaii quite often, so I'm sure we'll have a chance to get together in the not too distant future. And I'm really grateful for all of you joining today here in person and online. I know we're in the middle of August and that most people are on vacation. That's certainly at least the way it is in DC. So I appreciate you all coming out today for today's discussion. As Jean said, I'm no stranger to the East-West Center. My first interaction with the East-West Center, actually, when I was a Fulbright scholar doing my PhD dissertation research in Korea and Japan in 1990, and I came to Honolulu over the holidays for a break, and out of the blue emailed Charles Morrison, who was then president of the East-West Center, to ask me if I could talk about my research. And I sent the email and I went to the beach. I never expected a reply, but he replied. And we've been friends ever since. That was my first interaction with the East-West Center in 1990, so probably sometime before some of you at this table were even born. And so it's very deep and dear to my heart. And from an academic perspective, I've had the opportunity to benefit from the POSCO fellowships that Denny has run, and met a lot of great colleagues through that, as well as through some of the work that Mark Noland has done. But I really appreciate the opportunity in the summer to come and talk, because it's in the summer that I'm often thinking about new research ideas. Some of you heard me a couple of years ago on research we were doing about the G7, reform of the G7. And in this case, the beginning of the summer started off with these with the crisis in Iran and the military strikes on Iran by Israel and the United States. And a lot of the focus, of course, was on Israel, Iran, Gaza. But as somebody who looks at the Indo-Pacific and East Asia, I wanted to understand what are the implications of what has happened with Iran for the United States in terms of its policies in Asia, and particularly with regard to Korea, the Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea. So what I'm presenting to you today is just some of my initial thoughts on this issue. This is the first time that I'm giving this presentation. So in that sense, I'm always grateful to the East-West Center, because many of the ideas that end up becoming books and other things kind of start here. So I'm really thankful for that. Am I pressing the right button? I think I am. Okay. So if we could go to the first slide. So this is just basically a timeline of the strikes that were done by the United States against Iran on June 22nd. Next slide. So 7 US B-2 bombers dropped 14 massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster bombs on Iran's two of Iran's nuclear facilities, Fordow and Natanz. The U.S. also struck the Isfahan nuclear facility with more than 24 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles from a submarine. President Trump called the attacks a spectacular military success and claimed that, quote, Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated, close quote. Next slide. So this is just a satellite. So as some of you know, we do a lot of commercial satellite imagery work at CSIS. This is commercial imagery satellite overhead of the Fordow uranium enrichment facility. This was taken in July of 2025. Next slide. This is a picture of the Natanz nuclear facility in June 30th, 2025. You can see some of the damage that's already been done to this. This damage is actually before the U.S. military strike. This was the damage that was done by the Israeli military strikes, which preceded the U.S. bunker buster attacks. We do have imagery of the Natanz facility after the U.S. strikes, but it wasn't. They weren't annotated yet. The slides weren't annotated yet, so I couldn't bring them with me. Today. The next slide is the Isfahan nuclear facility. Here again, at least 17 buildings were damaged or destroyed, as you can see from the photo by the Israeli strikes, and again, this preceded the strikes by the United States. Next slide. So there was significant damage done to all three sites, Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, which led to a halting of operations. The United States and Israel did not attack all the sites. There were two in particular that were not on the target list, Pickaxe Mountain and the underground facility in Isfahan. And the disposition and location of the 400 kilograms of fissile material at the time of the strike were unknown. That 400 kilograms is about enough for 9 to 10 nuclear weapons. Next slide. So that kind of is a very brief overview of what happened in June. And the question is, what does all of this mean for Korea? What does it mean in particular for North Korea? There was some speculation that would North Korea sort of be the next target of US kinetic action? Is there really a use of force option when it comes to Korea? It's been reported that one of the arguments that the Israelis made to President Trump was to say that action needed to be taken against Iran now, because if it wasn't taken against Iran, Iran would become your next, meaning you, the United States, would become your next North Korea. And the reason that North Korea ended up the way that it was is because the United States doesn't have a credible use of force option on the Korean Peninsula. I'm not stating that as objective fact. I'm explaining the line of argument. And that the Israelis said to the United States, you do have a use of force option when it comes to Iran. We, meaning Israel, we are your use of force option. And of course, you can take action on your own. The fact that all air defenses were completely neutralized also played some role in this decision as well. So, but again, these strikes on Iran raise the question of, will North Korea be next? Is there a credible use of force option with regard to North Korea? And then thirdly, more broadly, what are the implications? Like, what are the implications of these military actions in the long term for the prospects for diplomacy, deterrence on the Korean Peninsula? Next slide. So as background, in terms of, we look at North Korea-Iran cooperation, they've basically been sort of in these four areas. The most prominent is the cooperation that we've seen between North Korea and Iran on missiles, in particular short-range ballistic missiles and medium-range ballistic missiles. There's been healthy cooperation over time between the two countries in this particular field. There has been speculation, again, in the open source materials, there's been speculation about potential nuclear cooperation between the two sides, both civilian scientific nuclear cooperation, potentially also military nuclear cooperation. In the past, North Korea has been a supplier of arms, small arms, to both Iran and Iraq, and in fact supplied both of them during the Iran and Iraq War. And then broadly, in terms of economic cooperation, both of them have a mutual interest in bilateral economic cooperation that evades international sanctions, right? Iran and North Korea are two of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. And so they have a common interest and common desire to engage in all sorts of trade as a way to circumvent the sanctions regimes that have been created both with regard to North Korea and with regard to Iran. The next slide, this is just shows you the missile cooperation in particular. In the 1980s, the Shahab-1 missile was essentially a North Korean Scud-B missile with ranges of 300 kilometers, otherwise known as the Hwasong-5. And in the 1990s, we saw cooperation in terms of Iran's Shahab-2 and Iran's Shahab-3 missile, which are also North Korean Scud-Cs and the Nodong-1 missile. So, a good part of the Shahab missile force is basically a North Korean short-range and medium-range ballistic missile. Next slide. So the broader context of this discussion, when we think about the implications of the Iran strikes on North Korea, the broader context of this is, of course, the growing cooperation that is taking place among at CSIS, we have a project, we call them the CRINCs, right? Korea, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Every think tank has a different name for this. Axis of Doom, I think, is what CNAS uses. Everybody's got a different, but this is the acronym that we use. This growing cooperation among China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. This is not an alliance in any way. It is much more of a loose network, but some parts of this network grow tighter than others at different periods in time. So it's not an alliance of any sort, but it is sort of this loose network of countries that are coalescing together. And one of the biggest spurs for cooperation from 2022 was, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which, whether coordinated or not, each of these countries, China, Iran, and North Korea, has been providing support for Russia in its war in Ukraine. And not sort of incidental or insignificant support, but very significant support that has buttressed Russia's war effort in Ukraine. The argument is not to say that the war in Ukraine was the thing that brought them all together. There are many factors that led them all together, but the war in Ukraine did at least create for the West evidence and appearance of very clear, perhaps loosely coordinated effort among these three countries to support Russia's efforts in Ukraine. So if you go to the next slide, this is going to be very difficult to see from where you're sitting. Maybe the only person who can see this will be Jean, because she's got a computer screen right in front of her. But this graphic sort of summarizes the sort of cooperation that has been taking place in this sort of CRINCs network. I mean, to summarize it, China has provided almost 100% of the microelectronics that were needed for Russia in terms of their missiles, in terms of tanks and aircraft. Iran provided artillery shells, but also provided a great deal of both civilian and military drone support for Russia's war in Ukraine. And of course, North Korea has provided a lot of munitions and soldiers for Russia's war effort. Some sources say now that North Korea accounts for almost 50% of Russian ammunition use in the war in Ukraine, particularly in the battle for Kursk, or the retaking of Kursk. They provided somewhere between 7 to 12 million rounds of ammunition. They've also provided scores of ballistic missiles, which Ukraine has provided evidence of, missile fragments that have landed in Ukraine, long-range self-propelled guns, and of course, 15 to 20,000 troops with commitments to send more, as well as commitments to send laborers and civilians. Next slide. Right, yeah, so that is, if you could just go to the next slide and then we'll go back. So our calculation is North Korea is making somewhere between $9.5 to over $12 billion for this package of munitions, artillery, missiles, soldiers, and workers. That is not counting all the activity that's taking place in terms of railway traffic between the two sides. So significant amount of earnings for North Korea from the war in Ukraine. If you go back to the previous slide. So just to bring this point home on DPRK Russia, and this is something else that I'm writing on. You know, we first learned about North Korea's involvement in the war in Ukraine when the Biden administration declassified for public consumption a photo that showed a discrete arms transfer from North Korea to the Wagner Group for support in the war in Ukraine. From our perspective on the outside, this was very useful because we could use the timestamp on that satellite imagery to do a comprehensive search of what was going on around that time between DPRK and Russia. And there was a lot. There was a lot going on. I didn't bring these slides, but the primary route for arms transfers were going from Najin Port in North Korea to Vostochnoy Port in Russia. This is tucked way up into northern North Korea and Russia, and then they went by land across Russia to the war front to 3 munitions depots that were near the war front. In addition to that, if you look at the 2 railroad crossings between DPRK and Russia, and in particular the Tumangan-Kasan railroad crossing, the amount of activity there is absolutely unprecedented. You can count cars in the customs zones on both sides of the Kasan railway crossing. You can look at all of the new infrastructure that's being built there, new railroad stations, new roads leading to the railway stations. Prior to the war in Ukraine, this was virtually an abandoned railway station. No, it was not used for any particular purpose. And now it's bustling like Grand Central Station. There's just so much traffic going on there. And we can tell by the shapes of the cars that some of them are grain cars, some of them are providing oil, all these sorts of things. In the broader scheme of things, this was a relationship that started out as very tactical and transactional, right? Putin needed munitions. North Korea was the only country in the world, with the exception of maybe Iran, that was willing to provide munitions, and the only country in the world that was willing to provide them on the scale that North Korea was providing them. It went from a very transactional relationship to becoming a very strategic one, where the two have signed a mutual security treaty. They provided security guarantees to each other. So this is a relationship that has come a long way from one that was, really virtually non-existent, certainly compared to the China-DPRK relationship prior to the war in Ukraine. And this is when, for those of you who study international relations theory, this is when you have to say that leadership and individuals really matter. I mean, they can really shape the course of things because, at least from what we can gather thus far, the primary engine for this sort of activity was Kim Jong-un, was the North Korean leader. The North Korean leader, I say here that he saved Kim Jong-un because the North Korean leader at the beginning of the Ukraine war was just coming out of a 3.5-year COVID lockdown, right? The longest lockdown of any other country in the world, a 3.5-year COVID lockdown where they had sealed the border with China. So they had no economic interaction with the country that it does 95% of its economic interaction with for 3.5 years. So North Korea came out of the COVID lockdown with no food, no energy, no medicine, nothing, no cash, nothing. On top of that, the last time we saw Kim Jong-un, before he came out of the COVID lockdown, the last time we saw him was when you had this spectacular failure of the summit in Hanoi, Vietnam, between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Some of you may remember Trump, he ended the meeting early, he left before lunch. On the first day, he left and said there's no deal to be made here. Apparently he did the same thing to Putin. Apparently, based on what we see in the papers, he left before lunch also. And the North Korean leader had to take the long train ride home from Hanoi to Pyongyang, right? Biggest diplomatic gambit in the history of North Korea, right? Face-to-face summit meeting with the US president, and the US president walked out, right? So horrible loss of face. The North Korean leader, it's all about myth-making and face. Horrible loss of face for the North Korean leader. Long train ride home. Then he goes into a COVID lockdown. So in this sense, the war in Ukraine, and when it became clear the way the war would proceed, that it would be sort of dug in, massive use of artillery, when it became clear that this was the war that was going to happen, and that Russia was in dire need of munitions, they didn't have enough munitions, Kim Jong-un took the initiative and proposed this, and this kind of led him to a point now where he's got $9 to $12 billion of hard currency coming in, all the food, grain, energy that he could possibly need, leverage vis-a-vis his relationship with China, and a variety of other things. So this, in many ways, saved Kim Jong-un. And of course, in June of 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a defense treaty, which essentially basically reinvigorated and expanded the treaty that the mutual friendship treaty that they had signed during the Cold War. Okay, next slide, please, and go to the next one. So this is what North Korea said about the Iran attacks. It was relatively speaking, it was a pretty neutral statement. It sort of kept things at arm's length. So this particular statement doesn't tell us much in terms of what the implications are. But I want to take you through now what I think are 5 potential implications of the Iran strikes for North Korea. Next slide, please. So the first of these is with regard to the question of CVID. CVID means complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. So in one sense, the Iran strikes most probably reaffirmed to North Korea that the nuclear path they are taking is the right path. It probably reaffirmed to them that they must have nuclear weapons in order to deter any action, future U.S. military action against North Korea. When we were doing 6-party talks, and Jim was involved in those as well. When we were doing 6-party talks, the North Koreans occasionally would go off script and say publicly that the United States attacked Afghanistan because it didn't have nuclear weapons, attacked Iraq because it didn't have nuclear weapons, but it will never attack North Korea because they have nuclear weapons, right? So this wasn't in their talking points. They said it actually at a moment when they were angry, but it sort of revealed a lot in terms of the way they think about the issue. So if anything, these strikes on Iran probably reaffirm or imprint even deeper in the North Korean mindset that they are on the right path with regard to these nuclear weapons. So in one sense, and these are, again, just thinking through, one of the implications of this is that while there may have been benefits to taking out and or setting back Iran's nuclear program, one of the costs of this may be that we've cemented for certain North Korea's commitment to nuclearization. Like the Iran strikes are living proof to North Korea that they need to continue on this path. So a reaffirmation of their intention. Next slide. Second implication of the Iran strikes is that North Korea and Russia were already growing close as a result of the war in Ukraine, but the Iran strikes probably pushed North Korea even closer to Russia, to reaffirm their security commitment to each other, to reaffirm their security guarantee that they would stand for each other's security, as they've said in the treaty. In fact, since the bombing of Iran, we've seen heightened diplomatic activity and political activity between Russia and North Korea that the North Koreans have purposefully made evident through publicizing. Right? So they've done worked extra hard to publicize all of their interaction with Russia. Some of these meetings, the ecology minister and others, in my opinion, normally wouldn't warrant a meeting with Kim Jong-un, but Kim Jong-un met with all of these individual visitors, which is, again, a sign trying to demonstrate the closeness of the relationship. Many of you know we passed a big holiday in Korea, August 15th. August 15th is Liberation Day in Korea, both in the north and the south. The head of the Russian Duma visited Pyongyang on the occasion of a Liberation Day, carrying greetings from President Putin. And Kim Jong-un and Putin had a phone call, right, with Putin congratulating him for Liberation Day, and also talking about the two as war allies in Europe, and talking about the soldiers fighting side by side as war heroes, right? So really trying to cement the demonstration of how close this relationship is becoming. Next slide. The third implication of the Iran strikes is, of course, potentially more cooperation, a spur to more cooperation between Iran and North Korea. If Iran is looking to reconstitute their nuclear programs, North Korea could certainly be a place that they would go. There have already been some reports in the press of Iran looking to Russia for help with reconstituting nuclear programs and their missile programs, their air defense programs, and the Russians have said, we can't help you right now, but go talk to the North Koreans, right? So there is, this could be a spur to even more cooperation between Iran and North Korea. And the second bullet here about unregulated North Korean behavior, I think, is important in the sense that, and I don't know, others who know China, Danny and others might feel differently, but to me, one of the biggest concerns about this tightening DPRK-Russia relationship is that North Korean behavior is unregulated. And what I mean by that is, the traditional patron for North Korea over the past 2-3 decades has been China. And although we, the United States and the US government, were often frustrated at how little China would use its influence to move North Korea in the direction of denuclearization or denuclearization negotiations, as frustrated as we were, in retrospect, one of the things that China did do was that they did manage to maintain some sort of they seem to somehow regulate North Korean behavior. Because it's not in China's interest for North Korea to, go off half-cocked and do all sorts of crazy things. So China always tried to regulate some behavior by North Korea. For example, not doing the 7th nuclear test, right? Or trying to bring them back to negotiations. It was imperfect, undeniably. But relative to Russia, they offered, some sort of regulatory framework on North Korea for their own benefit, not for the United States, for their own benefit. I have no sense that Russia does that. My sense is that Russia is in it for the transactional benefits and really doesn't care what North Korea does. So these press reports that the Iranians are looking to post-attack are looking to Russia for help, and the Russians are saying, we're busy, we have a war in Ukraine, but go talk to the North Koreans. This is, to me, is very bad, right? Because there isn't, and China doesn't have the influence that it used to because of the relationship that Russia has with North Korea. So yes, we would expect that after the attacks, Iran might look to reconstitute and might look to partners like Russia and North Korea to help. But what's the context that is different now is that Chinese relative influence on North Korea is less than it used to be in the past, at least I think. And therefore, and the Russians are not, I think, in any way trying to put guardrails on what North Korea might do. Okay, the fourth implication, and this is something that we actually heard in the immediate aftermath of the strikes, and I put this as a question more than a declaration, is to what extent do these strikes spur Kim and Trump to re-engage in diplomacy? It's pretty clear that President Trump does want to re-engage at some point, maybe not right away, but does want to re-engage. He constantly refers to the North Korean leader as his friend. The United States certainly doesn't need another crisis, given what is happening in the Middle East, in Ukraine. The president may feel that he has leverage now as a result of demonstrated military strikes on nuclear targets in Iran. And the president may feel like he's strengthened deterrence because he's proven that he's willing to take action, military action, against another nuclear threat. So for all these reasons, there may be this, potentially one of the implications of the Iran strikes is that it could lead to diplomacy or the restart of diplomacy between the United States and North Korea, in part because North Korea doesn't want to see the same thing happen to them, and in part because Trump feels he's in a position of strength now after the demonstration that he's taken against Iran. We believe, we don't know for certain, but we believe that President Trump will go to APEC in Gyeongju in Korea in this fall. And we have seen him in the past, when he's in the region, signal through social media that he wants to meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ in Panmunjom that happened last time. And so it's not entirely implausible that he might try to do something like that again. The fifth and the final implication is actually the flip side of the fourth implication. And this is probably the worst case implication in the sense that Iran strikes may not lead to a more deterred North Korea, but actually may lead to a more emboldened North Korea. We have to remember that deterrence is two-dimensional, right? Well, it probably has more than two dimensions, but the purpose, deterrence is two-dimensional, right? There are actions that we take, the United States, that we think are strong, that we believe demonstrate capabilities and resolve. And therefore, we take a military action and we think it strengthens deterrence, right? But as a lot of the academic and strategic literature tells us, deterrence is not just in the eyes of the deterrer, it is in the eyes of the deterree, right? In other words, we may think we take military actions that make us stronger, that strengthen deterrence, but if the recipient doesn't see it the same way, then our military actions are not strengthening deterrence. Right? Then the net assessment is deterrence is not strengthened, right? If the adversary doesn't view it that way. And so here, to me, the critical question is, how much did the United States set back the Iran program? Did it truly obliterate the program, as most recently Ambassador Huckabee just said? Did it set it back, scores of years, or even several years? Or did it not have the desired impact? A lot of this will depend on the bomb damage assessments that have been made. The most recent one, again, at least in the public domain that we've seen, has said that only one of the facilities was substantially damaged and that the other two weren't. And if this is the case, if the bomb damage assessment is such that the United States did not truly obliterate Iran's nuclear program, from a North Korean perspective, that could potentially embolden them, right? Their view could be, we're dug in deeper than the Iranians are. Like, our facilities are deeper than the Iranians are. The United States dropped a dozen of these massive ordnance penetrators, and they still could not take out the program. Right? They could still not do significant damage to the program. This, rather than scaring the North Koreans, could actually make them feel like, we're much stronger than we think. We're in a much stronger position we're actually in a much stronger position after these strikes than what we were before these strikes, right? And so again, this is where the point about deterrence and how we think about deterrence is not simply in the eyes of us, the ones who are carrying out the military strikes, but it also has to do with how others perceive the effectiveness of those strikes and their own capabilities to defend against those strikes. So, Gene, I think I'll stop there, if that's okay. I hate to end on a bad note like that, but we're talking about North Korea, so we rarely end on a good note. And I'll turn it back. I think Denny. So who's going to Denny? You're going to moderate the conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you. If I can, I'm going to first invite Hudson up to provide some housekeeping notes before Denny takes over. But I did want to thank you, Victor, for bringing this focus back around to the threat that faces us. Because of course, here in Hawaii, or for those of you in Hawaii, the way to look at the strikes on Iran is to think and connect the dot, think about the implications it has for the Indo-Pacific, and also think about the way that we can connect those dots and show how what happens in one part of the world has an impact and effect on what happens in our part of the world, which I would say is not only the United States, the continental United States, but of course the entire Pacific and Asia. And so absolutely. So I'm going to say that you called it first on a possible Kim Jong-un Trump handshake somewhere in the region. No, I do have the APEC summit in my calendar. Those are the kinds of things that, as those of us who watch North Korea, we put those dates. Now, I can tell you when I was an AP correspondent, I used to go to the APEC summits because we always knew that that was an opportunity for actually the North Koreans and the South Koreans to kind of meet surreptitiously on the sidelines, right? So those summits are an opportunity. Those meetings are an opportunity to have these meetings on the side. So absolutely, I have it in my calendar because I am watching that as well. I also want to thank you for bringing up CRINC, although I absolutely hate that acronym. And we are here, we hear more often axis of upheaval or axis of anger. But let's see how this goes. You know, with my podcast for the BBC, the Lazarus Group was often called Hidden Cobra by the US government. And I absolutely hate snakes. So I said, we are not calling it Hidden Cobra. I do not want to be living with cobras for the rest of my career. So that's why we've been calling it the Lazarus Group. So, but thank you for that attention, because this is precisely what I was hoping you would do, was to bring all these threads together and put into context why the strikes on Iran are something we're looking at, how this equates to what we're seeing with the diplomacy well beyond the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so I'm going to invite Hudson to come up and give us some housekeeping rules for the Q&A. And then I'm going to turn it over to Denny for, yes, hi.
Okay, so please use the microphones when you ask a question, and you'll need to press the button on there to turn it on, and then press the button to turn it off. And then when you ask your question, please identify yourself. And just a friendly reminder that this event is being recorded and will be posted to the East-West Center website and YouTube channel. So thank you.
We'll be taking questions both from in the room, from the live audience, and online. If you want to ask a question from online, use the Q&A button you'll see at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there and enter it. Let me ask first if there's anyone in the room who has a question. Ambassador.
Thank you, Denny, and thank you for the speaker. I'm Jim Moriarty, and I'm sorry, but I am going to use CRINC once again. One of the things that struck me, you gave the slide with the Russian response. The Chinese response was equally mealy-mouthed and did not go beyond. And it lent itself to a point that you raised earlier. This is in no way a formal alliance. I've got to wonder, however, if the North Koreans might be looking at this and saying, okay, when push comes to shove, the Chinese, the Russians are not going to have our backs. Let's play a three-dimensional game of details and think about, you know, how the whole reaction to what happened in Iran underscored that the CRINC is consisting of separate countries who are going to follow their own interests and are not going to in any way risk to one iota their interests for the benefit of any of the other members.
It's great. It's a great point, and I don't disagree with it. I think that's right. I would not expect. I mean, the sort of arm's length or two arm's length reactions by both the Chinese and the North Koreans to the Iran strikes certainly demonstrate they're not going to come to the defense of Iran in any way. But at the same time, I think they're going to take advantage of everything of the fallout, if you will, from those strikes. So Iran's need for reconstituting their air defenses, their ballistic missile program, their enrichment facilities. There, I think that, maybe not the Chinese, maybe the Chinese won't do it, and maybe the Russians even won't do it, but at least the Russians are not going to stop the North Koreans from providing support. Perhaps the Chinese would, but I'm really not sure how much influence China has on North Korea these days. Love to hear thoughts on this. My sense is that the Chinese talking point on the DPRK-Iran cooperation from November of 2022, when the administration first released those photos, has been the same talking point they're using today, which is it's a bilateral relationship. Those issues are theirs. We don't have a comment on it. That to me is either a signal that they are incapable of influencing that relationship, so they have a very anodyne talking point, or that they haven't decided what they want to do. And so they still have the same talking point that they've had for 3 years, right? But yeah, I agree. I think the response to the Iran strikes by China and North Korea demonstrate that, and Russia, that this is not an alliance per se. Yet the activities that might derive from Iran's response to the strikes are still very bad for the United States, because there will still be things that will be done within that group.
A question from online. How might South Korea's efforts to reestablish relations with North Korea be affected by what is happening regarding North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia interactions?
Yeah, so I think, we have a new government in South Korea. The president, he's coming to Washington, D.C. on Monday. We're coming on Sunday, and we'll be in the U.S. on Monday and Tuesday. This is a government that is very pro tension reduction and engagement with North Korea, and they've already taken a number of actions to try to reduce tensions, removing the loudspeakers, some other things, balloon launches, these sorts of things. But I think North Korea's interest in dialogue with South Korea is not very high right now. In part, I think it has to do with the war in Ukraine and all of the significant support it's getting from Russia. The transactional reasons traditionally for North Korea to engage with South Korea is to get fertilizer, to garner revenue from the Inter-Korean Economic Cooperation projects. They've basically gotten rid of those projects, and any fertilizer or other sorts of things that they might need, they're getting from Russia. So there's no transactional material need for them to engage. And I think, and they haven't responded positively to either South Korea or the United States. That's at least not what we know publicly. Who knows what's happening behind the scenes, but at least the public message from Kim Jong-un, and particularly his younger sister, has been really to not have any interest in engagement right now.
Thank you, Dr. Victor Char. My name's Russell Homa with APEC Hawaii, and author of the book called The Blueprint. But I know you've been giving us some insight on your valuable information. My question, I know with the Trump administration, we all got to think out of the box with our foreign policy and our trade regulations. So in terms of North Korea engaging with Iran, as well with so-called the BRICS, now with the BRICS nation, because we don't want North Korea to join the BRICS nation, and as well. So my question is that in the future, we need to reestablish the six-nation security talks again, or else, my concern is including Australia, India, and Canada +3. This way, we can, get those geographically our friends and allies to bring peace in the Korean Peninsula. So basically, we also need to engage that, be ready what's going to happen in North Korea. If North Korea keeps on coming with the nuclear arms and testing the missiles with our friends of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea with the Korean Peninsula, we're going to have an excuse to go terminate their nuclear facility, just like we did in Iran. and with their facilities. 'Cause we're just looking for excuse to find means, but first we need to do the diplomacy first, because our traditional way of engaging foreign policy is diplomacy. So first, before we go into any other hostile engagements.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for the comment. I mean, I do think that the prospects for multilateral security cooperation in Northeast Asia these days is not very good. There was a period of time where there was an effort, an experiment, an effort to try to get all the major powers in Northeast Asia focused on one particular security issue and hope that solving that security issue would create habits of dialogue, institutions, even trust that could then lead the United States, Japan, Korea, China, and Russia to engage on other things, right? This experiment was called the Six-Party Talks. And in the end, if you don't accomplish the one most proximate functional thing that you're supposed to work on, it's hard to sort of get the larger benefits, positive externalities from that cooperation. We were not successful in denuclearizing North Korea. The six-party agreements in the end failed. And for that reason, prospects for multilateral security cooperation went down. And of course, today, when we have US-China strategic competition, a war in the middle of Europe, spurred by the Russians, with tacit support from others, it gets harder and harder to think about that sort of multilateral cooperation. But I would say it's never like completely, we cannot completely rule it out. Because things do change, US policy can change. President Trump is not one who sticks to traditional policy conventions, and we will see him change positions. I mean, just look at what he's done on H-20 chips, like just completely changed the position. So nothing is impossible, I guess I would say, but the prospects for multilateral security cooperation right now are not very good.
Question from online. What do you think the relationships between Russia, Iran, the DPRK, and the United States will look like by the end of the Trump administration? Who will benefit from these recent actions by the United States, Russia, and the DPRK? A lot of room to run.
Russia, Iran, DPRK, and the United States. So not China.
Excluding China, yeah.
Excluding China.
Right. Feel free to add in China.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's really hard to predict what things will look like. 3 years from now. I mean, hopefully there's no longer a war in Europe. That there is an armistice or even a peace. Who knows? That the United States and North Korea are re-engaged in some sort of dialogue initiated by Trump. The United States does have an interest in breaking up whatever loose network that does exist between China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. We do have an interest in that. How much we can do to affect that simply through diplomacy, to me, is not clear at all. But the one thing that's for certain is that I think we are in a stronger position if we are well consolidated with our European and Indo-Pacific allies. That, to me, is like the number one thing that we could be doing, even if we have difficulty finding the right policy tools to try to break up whatever loose network exists between Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
In the room, anyone?
Yes.
Thanks, Victor. Mark Wall. I wanted to follow up, or have you follow up on your point about China's loss of influence. It would seem to me that they're not too comfortable about a more unrestrained North Korea. So what are your thoughts on how China is taking this?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. I think, and I don't know, Denny, others, you can weigh, Jim, you can weigh in. I mean, so I think one of the positive externalities of North Korea's growing relationship with Russia is it has spurred the Chinese to want to regain some sort of foothold in terms of their influence on North Korea. I think the amount of attention that China pays to North Korea is positively correlated with the amount of interaction the North Korean leader is having with other leaders in the world. So some of you may remember when President Trump announced that in his first term, he was going to meet the North Korean leader. At that point, I can't remember the exact year, but at that point, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Xi Jinping had not met the North Korean leader. This was well over 5 years into the North Korean leader's position. Xi Jinping had not met with him. After Trump announced his willingness to meet with the North Korean leader and before the Singapore summit in 2018, Xi Jinping met with him 5 times. So again, China always says to the United States, oh, we don't have a lot of influence over North Korea. You overestimate our influence over North Korea. But they jealously guard whatever influence they have. And in fact, after the failure of the Hanoi summit, when the US-DPRK diplomacy came to a halt, Xi Jinping stopped meeting with Kim Jong-un, just stopped meeting. With regard to Russia, there was no bilateral trade between China and North Korea for the 3.5-year COVID lockdown, literally zero. Once they reopened, and it was actually at a conference here at East-West Center, I remember Korean economists were saying that Chinese bilateral trade with North Korea had not yet reached pre-pandemic levels. After Kim Jong-un went to Vladivostok, his first trip to Vladivostok, bilateral trade exceeded pre-pandemic levels in the quarter following Kim Jong-un's visit to Vladivostok. So the Chinese, I think they guard their influence very closely, and this is greatly beneficial to Kim Jong-un because, international relations, you want to always occupy the pivot position where 2 other countries are coming to you for help. They want your allegiance, right? This is classic Kissingerian diplomacy, right? And North Korea now occupies that position. The Russians want them for their support in the war in Ukraine. The Chinese want to try to offset Russian influence. So they're in an extremely good position right now. And that goes to the other question about why they're not interested in dialogue with a progressive South Korean government that is interested in dialogue with them. And perhaps not even interested in meeting with the United States, despite subtle signals by the US president that he's willing to re-engage. So I think, for China, I think it's a real policy dilemma because I think their traditional modus operandi is that they support North Korea enough to keep them afloat, not to allow them to collapse, to keep them afloat, but not support them so much that the North Koreans feel they have a blank check. But they have to find a way to compete with Russia now for influence in North Korea. And so I think they face their own sort of policy dilemma here.
Question from online. Suppose North Korea develops its nuclear capabilities to the point it is safe from US attack. Will its objectives then shift toward moving to take over South Korea?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. One could certainly imagine nuclear coercion or nuclear blackmail scenarios in a situation like that. I will say that there was a national intelligence estimate on North Korea that was done. There was a declassified version of it that was presented at CSIS by the National Intelligence Officer in North Korea. And the conclusion of that report was that North Korea would engage in nuclear coercion or some form of nuclear coercion or blackmail as it develops its capabilities. We just had, myself and Joe Bermudez just published a book on North Korea's sea-based WMD capability, which is basically a history that shows that North Korea is fully committed to developing the second leg of the triad, right? And undersea nuclear capability, fully committed to that. And the war in Ukraine also impacts that because there's a great deal of concern that Putin is willing to provide technologies that the Soviet Union traditionally would not provide to North Korea during the Cold War. They would not do it. But there is concern, not because we have evidence that Putin is saying he's going to do that, but like, at least in my mind, because the North Korean leader has been so open about a nuclear submarine capability. He's visited the Shinpo, right? One of the places where they build submarines. He's stood behind next to a mock-up of a nuclear submarine. So he's talked about fielding a nuclear submarine force. So these sorts of things, again, you're trying to put pieces together, not because the Russians have said we're giving them technology, but they're giving them a lot of things. The NIE said very clearly that the United States is concerned that Russia is, I think the language was Russia is may drop long-held non-proliferation norms when it comes to North Korea. And then we see in North Korea the leadership being very open. They're putting the leader out there saying, I'm going to acquire a nuclear submarine capability. They would not do that if they were not confident that they were able to accomplish that.
We've reached our hard stop time. Is there possibly one more crisp burning question from in the room?
Yeah, I'm Jong from the Korean Consulate.
Yes.
I have a question about this, like a UN resolution on the Iran nuclear program. I heard that it's like 18th of October, this Iran resolution expired, but the Western country actually they want to trigger this like a snapback mechanism before this expiration. So do you think that this Western country really triggered this snapback mechanism, and then after they are like triggering this mechanism, maybe Israel will attack again the Iran, because that many speculate that right now Iran is like a weakest situation after this like a revolution. So maybe the Israel doesn't want to this like how can I say this? They really want to attack Iran again when the Iran is the really weakest situation.
Yeah. I mean, these are great questions, and I think you can probably answer them better than I can, based on your experience in Tehran. Yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. and Western allies could certainly exercise the snapback sanctions. How effective they'll be, I can't say for sure. We know in general that without Chinese and Russian cooperation in the UN Security Council, there's very little that we can get done. The Russians have effectively destroyed the 11 resolution strong UN Security Council sanctions regime on North Korea, right? It's effectively gone now, right? Completely gone now. So they may be able to do the same thing on the Iran sanctions, but obviously the Americans and the Europeans would be at the forefront of that. With regard to Israeli intentions, I can't speak on that. I just don't. I can ask some of my Middle East expert friends at CSIS to come out and give that talk. So.
Yeah, this concludes the Q&A. I'll turn the microphone back to Jean. She's still online.
I'm still here. Thank you, Denny. Thank you, Victor, not only for another illuminating session, but for teeing us up for another one on Iran. And mahalo to everyone for joining us in person and online. So please join us for our next talk with Dr. Kira Vinke, who leads the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. She's speaking on September 18th on climate change and foreign policy, intersections of security, mobility, and international cooperation. And please follow Dr. Cha's example and let us know if you have any suggestions for topics and speakers, or if you'd like to get more involved with the East-West Center. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or send a message through the East-West Center website. You can send a message to me. Mahalo, and Victor, I hope I see you before you leave.
Thanks, Jean. Thank you, everybody.